Boa tarde. Estamos iniciando mais um webinar do Itaú Unibanco. Meu nome é Christian Nigan, sou diretor responsável pelas áreas de Global Markets e Tesouraria. Vamos ter mais um evento patrocinado pelo Itaú Unibanco. Esse evento hoje será transmitido em português. Inicialmente, faremos a mudança para o inglês, pois os dois apresentadores estão desconectados de fora do país. Eu vou passar a palavra em seguida para o Mário Mesquita, que é o nosso economista-chefe e o diretor responsável pelas áreas globais de Research. O Mário fará a introdução dos palestrantes em breve e seremos transmitido automaticamente para inglês, com transmissão ao vivo pelo canal do LinkedIn do Itaú BBA. Mário, o microfone é seu.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. It is a pleasure and an honor for us to host two very distinguished speakers, Niall Ferguson and Pierpaolo Barbieri, who are joining us to discuss this extraordinary set of events. Niall Ferguson is the Unibanco Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution in Stanford, and Senior Faculty Fellow of the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard. He is the author of 15 books, including The Pity of War, excellent book I read, The House of Rothschild, Empire, Civilization, Kissinger, reading right now, which won the Council of Foreign Relations Arthur Ross Prize. He's a very distinguished scholar, analyst, a thinker about current affairs and about history and its implications for the present and the future. Pierpaolo Barbieri is the founder of well-known fintech Voila in Buenos Aires. He also serves as executive director at Green Mantle, a macroeconomic and geopolitical consulting firm, and is a senior associate at the Applied History Center or Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He was also chief strategist of the Brabant Howard Argentina Fund. Niall, I remember hearing you in Davos earlier this year, and you ended up your pre-dinner talk about mentioning the risk posed by coronavirus and by potential pandemic. At the time, I mean, people were focusing more on the dinner that lay ahead of them than on the very real threat that you mentioned. And little did we know, a few weeks later, the whole world had changed because of this pandemic, right? So I thought it was a very interesting remark, and whenever when the situation starts to unravel, we thought about bringing you to talk to us because you saw it first, and we are very happy to have you with us today. So I'll pass the word to you right now. Thank you very much, Niall and Pierpaolo, for joining.
Well, thank you, Mario. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes. Yes, we can.
In the new era of working from home and home schooling, you kind of need to have two homes, one for the work and one for the schooling, but most of us are having to cope with one. If one of my children bursts in, you'll realize that this is now pretty much the norm. Remember when that poor man, an American academic, was giving an interview last year about North Korea in his home study, and his two kids burst in. Everybody laughed at him for weeks, but we're all going to have that experience now. So he's one of the few beneficiaries of the pandemic. Mario, I'm glad you mentioned the Davos talk, because I began warning people about what was happening in Wuhan around that time. I'd been first made aware of it in the first week of January, shortly before I made a trip to Hong Kong and Taipei and Singapore. And on my trip, I heard more and more anxious conversations about this strange new virus with pneumonia-like symptoms in the city of Wuhan. And by the time I got to Davos, I was fully persuaded that something very serious was happening. Now, you may wonder why somebody with a background like mine, an interest in history, and particularly economic history, should have been so aware of the risk of a Chinese virus. But as a historian, I've spent a lot of my career thinking about two things: big disasters, because that's what historians tend to focus on. We don't write many books about the boring years, and networks, because it's through networks that things go viral, whether they're biological viruses or digital viruses. Early in my career, I did a book about the First World War. And one of the things I learned when I was writing that book was that there had been a massive influenza pandemic in 1918-19, which had swept the world, killed more people than the war itself. We now think somewhere close to 50 million people lost their lives because of the influenza of 1918-19. And it was probably one of the reasons that the German army collapsed in the late summer of 1918. I discovered in the archives a tremendous resource, monthly data on the German army, including the number of soldiers reporting sick. And it struck me as very strange that this number had doubled suddenly in, from memory, the month of August 1918. Well, it turned out that that was the influenza pandemic. I have spent a lot of my recent career working on networks, social networks and other kinds of network. And if you look at my most recent book, The Square and the Tower, there's a lot in there about contagion, digital as well as biological. There's a little chapter in the middle of the book about the 1918-19 pandemic. So I've, I suppose, been made aware by history of the danger of a pandemic. And when I was at Davos in January, where everybody was talking about climate change, and for our next meeting, we'll talk about climate change, I kept saying, this is absurd. The risks of climate change are years away. The risk of a pandemic is here and now. It's begun. And I started to write about this. We sent, I think, our first Green Mantle report on the subject on January the 22nd. And week after week, we tried to persuade our clients that something very bad was happening, that it was going to be bad for China, but not just for China. It was highly likely to spread beyond China's borders. And we started to predict that it would have negative impact for equities in February and predicted the US recession towards the end of February. So I think I and Pierpaolo have a reasonable claim to have called this. And I only wish more of our clients had listened, because I have the distinct impression that a number of them thought I was being some kind of Cassandra, prophet of doom. They found out the hard way that on this occasion, doom was the right thing to prophesy. I'll say a few brief things about where we are and where I think we're going. But then I think I'll hand over to Pierre, and he can add some thoughts, perhaps emphasizing the Latin American dimension, but also the markets dimension. And then I think we should get into a discussion, because I'm sure you have many questions. The first thing I think to say is that this is one of those rare global pandemics which are very disruptive because of the peculiar quality of the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19, the disease. And that is that it's both highly contagious and quite deadly. It's highly contagious because you can have it and be shedding viruses left, right, and center without knowing it. A very substantial proportion of cases are asymptomatic. We don't know how many. We're still trying to figure out what proportion of cases have no symptoms. And when people get the virus, there are several days before they exhibit symptoms, if they're going to exhibit symptoms. This is why it's the stealth virus. Other coronaviruses, for example, SARS, the original version back in 2003, made people very ill very quickly and made it impossible for them to jump on a plane to John F. Kennedy Airport. It was a lethal disease, SARS, with a very high mortality rate for all people who caught it. Well, this, as I said, is a quite lethal virus, by which I mean it's not as lethal as SARS, but it's a lot more lethal than influenza. The thing is, we just don't know how much more. Strange as it may seem, despite all the modeling that has been done and all the scientific papers that have been published in the last 2 months on the subject, we still don't exactly know how many people get this disease, what the infection rate is for a population, and we don't know what the mortality rate of all those people who are infected is. All we know is the case fatality rate. And that is a very misleading number because it depends heavily on how many people are identified as confirmed cases. Because of the asymptomatic proportion in a population, it's absolutely clear that these case fatality rates are much, much higher than the likely true mortality rate, the number of people who die out of all the people who get the virus. So we are still in a state of considerable uncertainty about just how dangerous, exactly how dangerous COVID-19 is. And I think it's that uncertainty which explains a number of striking features of its spread. Those countries which had experience of SARS and of MERS, incidentally, predominantly East Asian countries, learnt the hard way to have a system in place for rapid response in the event of a new virus emanating from China. Historically, new viruses have a tendency to emanate from China. That goes all the way back to the Black Death of the 14th century. It was also true of a number of the major influenza pandemics of the 20th century. So they were ready. And because they were ready, as soon as they were aware there was a problem, they started testing. South Korea and Taiwan and Singapore all jumped rapidly into action and did a pretty good job of containing the spread of COVID-19 in their geographies. South Korea had an outbreak despite its best efforts because of the phenomenon of the super spreader. And this brings me to a very important point that you must understand about epidemiological models. They're very much used by politicians these days. In fact, you'll see all over the world politicians deferring to epidemiologists, including my near namesake, Niall Ferguson, the other Niall Ferguson at Imperial College London, who's had a great influence on policy in both the United Kingdom and the United States. But his model has produced very different projections of the likely number of fatalities, because these models are subject to really considerable variation, just depending on the variables that you plug in. And since we don't know key variables, as I said, we don't really know how lethal it is, we don't know how many people are asymptomatic, there's a chance that these epidemiological models are giving us really quite false projections of what's going to happen, or what will happen if we don't do what the epidemiologists say we should do, which is pretty much shut down our economy. The other thing about the models is that they don't really take account of the fact that when a virus spreads, whether it's a biological or digital virus, it spreads far and fast, depending on not just its own properties, but also the structure of the network that it attacks. Now, we happen to have, as a result of technology, transport and communications technology, the most integrated world network we've ever had. There's never been such integration of humanity. And COVID-19 as a disease takes advantage of that. It spread initially through air routes. Wuhan turned out to be pretty well connected to most of the major economic centers of the world, including Europe and the United States, with direct flights to airports in both continents. And that's how this virus first became a global problem, because it was being exported very rapidly by people infected through air transport. But what happens next has a lot to do with local networks. It's how it gets from the airport to, for example, an old folks' home in Seattle that is really crucial here. In the case of South Korea, one woman, patient 31, managed to spread the virus to over 1,000 people in the space of just a few days before it was realized that she was sick. And super spreaders like her have played a key role in other geographies too, notably Italy. A handful of very well-attended events, a football match in Italy, for example, led to a massive increase in the number of people who were infected. Epidemiological models can't take account of social networks, and they can't take account of the very big differences in social networks between a country like, say, Italy and a country like the United States, which is why we need to be very careful in accepting the projections that the epidemiologists make. We are flying blind, and each country has a different kind of social network for the virus to attack. The second point I want to make is that the United States, and to a degree also the United Kingdom, waited fatally too many weeks before realizing the need for action. And those weeks allowed the virus to spread much further than it need have. If we'd been South Korea, if we'd got testing to move fast enough, and if we'd used technology to do contact tracing, then COVID-19 would have spread much less far in the UK and the US. And I think we're paying a very heavy price for those mistakes, those sins of omission during February and into March, when the British Prime Minister and the American President both insisted that this was not such a dangerous virus that you needed to take drastic action. And I think that delay is going to have a much larger economic cost than a human cost. Let me put it this way. What we know about COVID-19 so far, and we know a little more every day, is that it disproportionately kills people who have left the workforce, people who've retired, people over the age of 65. In the Italian case, and Italy's had one of the worst experiences, the overwhelming majority of the people who died of COVID-19 were very elderly indeed, in their 80s in many cases, and nearly all had some pre-existing condition. This makes COVID-19 very different from past pandemics. The influenza pandemics of 1918 and 1957 were as likely to kill young people as old people. And the same went for previous pandemics going all the way back to the 14th century and beyond. So this is a very unusual pandemic because it disproportionately kills people who were already quite close to death, to be brutally frank about it. If you look at the mortality numbers for an average year, whether it's in Brazil or the United States, about 60 to 75% of the people who die in any given year are older than 65 or older than 70. So we need to think very carefully about what exactly it is that we're trying to achieve with large-scale lockdowns of the economy, if this is a disease that disproportionately targets the economically inactive, and especially if the mortality rate turns out to be lower than we've been led to expect. The risk, I think, that is currently being run very clearly in the United States is of triggering an absolute economic disaster for the sake of what might turn out to be a relatively modest increase in the seasonal mortality of seniors, of people aged over 65. My worry at the moment is that we've actually overshot in the social distancing and economic mandated measures that have been taken, that the fiscal and monetary measures that we've passed to try to offset the economic shock are really unequal to that task, because they're really nothing more than Panadol, aspirin, for a much more serious disease. By the way, this cough is just to give you the impression that I might myself have contracted COVID-19. And so we are, I think, creating a very large economic crisis for the sake of a public health benefit that may, in fact, be exaggerated. Let me say a few words about the economic and financial consequences and then hand over to Pierre. It won't have escaped your notice that this has been a bloodbath for equity markets. Worse, in fact, than the bloodbath of 2008, 2009. And also, you'll have noticed that markets are anticipating an extremely bleak short run. You can see that in the way that the US Treasury yields has gone down. And although great fiscal and monetary measures have been taken, far larger than the measures that were taken in the immediate aftermath of 2008, there is still a sense that the economy is in free fall. And we wait with a kind of horror the next set of economic data that will indicate we've actually managed to do something to ourselves even worse than the 2008-2009 crisis. In fact, it begins to look as if we're reenacting 1929 to 1932 with the tape speeded up by about a factor of 10. I think this is a very ugly moment, particularly because the US is still not over the worst of the pandemic. The situation in New York hospitals is almost certainly going to get worse over the next 2 weeks, which means that public perceptions are going to get more panic-stricken as video footage of disastrous hospitals goes out on cable news at night. I therefore think that we haven't seen the bottom for US equities just yet. And those people who were telling me last week that that was the bottom and it was time to buy are looking kind of foolish at this point. In any case, US equities weren't particularly undervalued last week. And it seems to me if you look at a cyclically adjusted PE number of the sort Robert Shiller calculates, we really have room for quite a bit of further downward movement in equity prices under these circumstances. So we don't think the bottom is here yet. I don't think the bottom is actually going to come until we have a better handle on the scale of the public health emergency and how much needs to be done to bring it under control. I think in the next few weeks, we'll begin to get a handle on that. And as we get a handle on that, begin to realize just how dangerous, not that dangerous, the virus is, then I think we'll begin to see some calmness restored. And we'll begin to talk about ending lockdowns and returning to some kind of normalcy by perhaps May or June. Pierre, before I am completely consumed by this cough, I'm going to hand over to you.
Okay.
Thank you, Niall.
If I can add a couple of things, very short, and then we can get to what we wanted, which was a real discussion. The first one is that obviously the lack of fiscal capacity in a lot of emerging markets are going to mean that as the developed markets struggle but answer fiscally and monetarily as they did in 2008, we can have the discussion about whether or not they're fighting the life crisis with the wrong tools for this one. But emerging markets don't have that possibility. What we see, and we are seeing threats in countries like Turkey today, Ecuador over the last few weeks, where we expect a very imminent default, Argentina, where a default now at this point guaranteed, and we expect things to get considerably worse for emerging markets without the fiscal capacity to answer to this problem. But the other issue that we're looking at in the United States is the real effect of the sudden stop on an economy where the safety nets of Europe don't really exist and where the bailout was designed in such a way that you have banks as intermediaries for SBA lending at a time when a lot of the providers of employment in the United States are small businesses to which it's going to be difficult to lend. The Fed doesn't buy their bonds because they don't issue bonds. And so when their revenues are down 90, 95%, what we have the fear of is a crisis that starts as a pandemic and despite a very large stimulus bill, turns into a financial crisis by virtue of the fact that you have a sudden stop in small businesses to which it's very difficult to lend. And where if you don't have money in the next 2 to 3 weeks to pay salaries, you're going to see exponential cascading effects of defaults, and that rolls through the economy. And then you actually get into the dynamic of 2008, 2009, even though the beginning of the crisis was nothing like that, and it was triggered by something epidemiological rather than financial. Happy to have a deeper discussion about emerging markets and how we're seeing them. In Europe, what we see is more evidence of a lot of action from the ECB, especially with its new PEPP program, where the old ideas of limiting things to the capital key have been thrown out the window. And at the end of the day, the European Central Bank is behaving more and more like a lender of last resort, at least in this stage of the crisis, and is doing precisely what Christine Lagarde said that they would not do, which is to close spreads. That is what emerging market banks, central banks cannot do, and where the fiscal capacity of many of these markets that we follow at Green Mantle has severely hindered to answer to this crisis because they were in crisis before that. So we think that Lebanon and Ecuador and now Zambia and Argentina are the beginning and not the end of an emerging market crisis.
Okay, thank you very much for this initial remarks. I think we can now start the Q&A session, and I'll ask Niall if you could. Just following up on Pierre's remarks. How do you compare this crisis with the purely financial crisis? Is it going to be worse? Is it going to be one in which we have a V-shaped recovery, or is more like a continuation of very slow growth, or even a deeper global slowdown than the one that we saw since 2008?
Thanks, Mario. I think the answer is that as long as we keep thinking it's a financial crisis, we're going to misunderstand it. We're going to expect fiscal and monetary measures to have some effects that they can't have so long as the public health crisis is ongoing. And so my starting point is let's not make the category error of thinking that this is a financial crisis. In the first instance, it's a public health crisis. And the good news is that a pandemic, it doesn't last as long as a financial crisis. The pandemic itself can't really last longer than at most 18 months because history tells us that these things come in. You either contain it or you end up racing towards herd immunity with all the vulnerable people dying. That's going to be the experience of certainly some African countries. In the space of 18 months, the vaccine gets devised and made available, and therapies perhaps also. And so we know that by this time next year, we'll more or less have a handle on this. We might have more than one wave of it. I think it's quite likely that it will turn out to be sensitive to the weather, and we'll get some respite in the Northern Hemisphere, and you'll find yourselves with more problems in the course of the middle of the year. But I think that much we can say with confidence. The financial crisis of 2008, 2009 kept going and going and going, and recovery proved anything but V-shaped because the problems of bank solvency or bank undercapitalization turned out to be very widespread. And even once the problem had been addressed in the United States, it turned out that the Europeans hadn't even begun to address a much bigger problem. And so we had the phenomenon of a near decade of stagnation because the financial crisis just dragged on. And once it had been at least partly resolved in the US, it started in Europe. My sense is that this will be a more severe but shorter duration shock. And that's certainly what history would lead us to expect. The caveat I'd add is that we could turn it into a financial crisis by using the kind of overkill that I talked about earlier. If you just shut down the economy, if you just tell a whole bunch of small businesses to stop trading, then there is, as Pierre rightly said, only a very short period of time before they simply go out of business. And there's no amount of fiscal and monetary relief that will really compensate for that. You've decided to have a depression, basically. And if you're not careful, you'll trigger financial cascades that at this point, very few people have even thought about. I see all kinds of lurking problems in the corporate bond market in the United States. There are CLOs, which it's hard to see really having much value under the circumstances I'm describing if the shutdown, if the stop of the economy is prolonged for too long. So I think the risk, Mario, is that we risk turning a public health emergency into a financial crisis by the kind of overkill that I've talked about. They haven't cratered their economy in South Korea. They didn't do that in Taiwan either. But because we decided to delay, pretend it was just the flu, and then panic, we've ended up in the worst of both worlds, where we've got actually an uncontained spread of the virus and a really severe economic shock. So the more I think about this, the more I'm inclined to believe that the US really can't afford a very protracted shutdown. I'm not of the persuasion that we could have reopened the economy on Easter, as President Trump seemed to believe a week ago. But I don't think it can be really much beyond the month of April, because if you don't get things going again in the course of this month, then I think there are going to be second-order financial effects that no amount of monetary and fiscal stimulus will be able to compensate for. There's a piece of the story that we haven't talked about, which is really important, and that's China. In the financial crisis, China was actually a crucial source of stimulus for the world, because the Chinese did a huge credit-fueled stimulus, did a ton of infrastructure, and effectively bailed out a lot of the rest of the world in the period after 2009. China, of course, is where all this began. In that sense, I was right back last year when I said the next financial crisis wouldn't start in the US, it would start in China. I didn't realize it would start with a pandemic, but hey. The Chinese are frantically trying to have a V-shaped recovery. And the evidence is that they're doing a reasonably good job of it. But there are still significant headwinds for them. Their state-owned enterprises are doing what they're told, but small businesses find themselves in a somewhat similar position to small businesses elsewhere in the world. The supply shock that this began with in China is a demand shock globally now, and it's very hard for China unilaterally to have a V-shaped recovery. So we're watching very closely signs of economic activity in China and getting mixed signals, frankly. Some things suggest a very rapid V-shaped recovery, like Chinese coal consumption. Oh yes, remember how worried you were about climate change? Relax, the Chinese are burning coal almost at normal levels. But if you start looking at other measures, small business activity, use of subways in major cities, things still look like they're kind of 50% below normal. So I think a key question really is how far China and indeed East Asia generally can bounce back. If they can sustain a V-shaped recovery, then there is some hope that the world isn't going to be dragged into a depression by this.
Thank you very much, Niall. Chris?
Niall, you touch on a very delicate point, which is the balance of protecting the population from the pandemic versus the social and economic cost of shutting down countries, economies, huge parts of the population. And this balance becomes even trickier when you move to emerging markets. As Pierpaolo put it very correctly, the fiscal tools available are much more contained, much smaller. Now, it looks like the way things are going, we're going to have to fight this pandemic for much longer, right? And especially, with the need to reopen these economies. What do you think? What is the right strategy for countries to be able to balance and find a way to reopen the economies on a sustainable way that will allow the health system to still deal with the ongoing issue of coronavirus?
Well, I think the answer to that question, which incidentally I was asked by the government of another South American country just a few days ago, is that you can't really have a shutdown of the sort that we've seen in many European countries, because I don't think that social stability will stand it. And so you have to start learning from the East Asian experience how you deal with the problem like this in a more targeted way. That means testing. Of course, you have to start trying to find out who has the virus, because until you know that, it's very difficult to do anything other than a very blunt kind of policy. And the second thing is contact tracing. Now, South America has a big advantage in that it has almost 100%, if not beyond 100%, smartphone penetration. And with smartphones, you can do what the Taiwanese and the South Koreans have done, and that is you can very efficiently contact trace once you've identified infected people. At the same time, you, I think, need to make sure that you distinguish between the at-risk and the not at-risk populations. I think we now know enough about COVID-19 to know that people over 65 are just much more at risk than people in their 20s and 30s, and even in their 40s. Unfortunately, people in their mid-50s have to kind of very carefully weigh up their decisions, because we're kind of in a grey area, not quite oldies, but getting there. But that means that it's rational to kind of tell the elderly, really do self-isolate. You're most likely to have high mortality through domestic spread, grandparents getting the disease from children who don't have any symptoms at all. That's what took Italy, and it's taking Spain into hell. And so I think there's some very obvious policy measures that can be taken to reduce the mortality by making isolation of the elderly a real priority. But I don't think that a country like Brazil or any of its neighbors should be simply smashing the glass and pressing the button that switches off economic activity. I don't think that's warranted by the public health threat. I think there's obviously a bunch of things that you need to do to offset the economic shock that there's nevertheless going to be. But as Pierre rightly said, there's no way you can do multi-trillion stimulus bills in the casual way that the US Congress can. So there's definitely much less fiscal and monetary room for maneuver. I think under those circumstances, the most important thing is to avoid a breakdown of public order in the big cities. And Brazil's interesting to me because it has some of the biggest and most densely populated cities in the world. Although population density isn't the only thing you need to know, it's a pretty big part of what causes a virus to spread rapidly. There's a reason that it's New York that's been most affected in the US. So I think Brazil has to make a kind of conscious decision not to let those cities descend into chaos. We're watching what's happened in India with kind of disquiet, because my sense is that to try to do a European-style lockdown in the Indian economy is just a recipe for disaster. And I don't think it can be sustained for very long before there's going to be quite serious communal violence. So the advice that I've been giving is there really has to be a more East Asian approach insofar as you have the capacity to do it, and a recognition that the principal vulnerability is amongst the elderly population, not people in midlife, and particularly not in their young years.
If I can add one very short thing there, is that even in Western societies and in European societies like Italy, we were just discussing with the rest of the Green Mental team how there is already breakdown of the full quarantine. In Italy, 3 weeks into a full lockdown, you're already starting to see people go out and ignore the quarantine. So it's not just an economic issue, it's also a social issue. There's some sort of limit at which people go crazy and they start disrespecting the rule anyway. So you might as well get the economic production, lest your economy get completely destroyed.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Niall. Some people are saying that while this started out in China, the solution is also coming from China and has to do with its ability to quickly lock down and then liberate economic activity again. That has to do with the system of government. And some people have writing and saying that, well, this is going to show that Western liberal democracy is not in that kind of situation as effective as a more centralized system of government. Are we going to see that kind of implication from this crisis? Are we going to have, and also from a geopolitical viewpoint, what are going to be the winners and losers, if there are any winner from this situation?
Well, Mario, that's definitely what the Chinese want us to think, that they're in fact the people who sorted out this problem first, and they're the people who are now helping the struggling Western democracies by sending them masks and other emergency medical supplies. The Chinese propaganda effort has been really remarkable, considering that this is all their fault. And I think it's very important that we push back against this narrative, because the reality is that it's the Chinese one-party system which made this happen, because officials in Wuhan and in Hubei province had an incentive to lie about the fact that a new coronavirus had come into existence and was being transmitted from humans to other humans. They lied about that in just the same way that the Chernobyl people lied about the risks they were taking with the nuclear power plant back in the Soviet Ukraine in the 1980s. So let's not forget why this has happened. Not only did they lie and conceal the extent of the problem throughout the month of January, even as the virus was spreading rampantly through the population of Wuhan and the other cities of Hubei. When they did finally realize how badly they'd screwed up, they first imposed a travel ban from Wuhan and Hubei to the rest of China. It was only after some days that they restricted travel from China to the rest of the world. And that, I think, requires really some serious scrutiny, because it's clear that flights were still going from Wuhan to Rome, Paris, London, JFK, New York, and San Francisco, right up until the end of January. And indeed, I came across one of those flights that landed in early February. That's outrageous, and requires far more condemnation than there has yet been. I think the other thing to point out is that not all democracies have screwed this up. I mean, I think the English-speaking democracies haven't done particularly well, although New Zealand comes very near the top of a league table of governments that got it right that I saw yesterday. And Canada doesn't seem to be making as big a mess of it as the United States. In Northern Europe, the Germans are feeling smug because they really have had a very good pandemic so far with remarkably few fatalities. And the Swedes are so confident in their ability to manage it that they actually haven't done a lockdown at all, and schools are still running normally in Sweden. The truth is that when you drill down into which countries did best, it's actually been democracies that have done best. Taiwan, which, as I mentioned earlier, I visited in early January, not only just had a very successful election in which the anti-Beijing candidate won, but also has by far the best system for dealing with this kind of health emergency. They've managed to solve the problem of using digital data to track potential infected people without violating privacy. It's a pretty impressive setup when you see it. South Korea comes again near the top of the table. Actually, in that league table I mentioned, the country that has the best record is Israel. Because, of course, if like Israel and Taiwan and South Korea, you're threatened in all kinds of ways and don't have a particularly great confidence in the international community, then your defenses are just generally good. No, I think the real lesson is that the two biggest economies in the world failed in their different ways. China failed because it allowed a Chernobyl-like disaster to happen and then sought to cover it up, and is now trying to cover up the cover-up with propaganda. In fact, I think Xi Jinping is behaving much worse than Mikhail Gorbachev did after Chernobyl, just to put that in perspective. But the United States has screwed up in its own way. And it's not just that the president got it wrong, which he certainly did. I think the whole American system, CDC, FDA, both the institutions that should have had this covered, screwed up epically. That the lack of adequate testing, which continues to be a problem here in April, is a scandal. And there'll have to be a full inquiry into why it was that the United States, despite multiple warnings from people like Bill Gates and Nassim Taleb and even Niall Ferguson, despite many warnings from public intellectuals about the risks of a pandemic, the US defenses appear to have been completely non-existent. And that's the real shocker to me, that so little adequate preparation had been made. And I don't think that problem can simply be pinned on Donald Trump.
Thank you very much.
I noticed, Mario, you asked a question about the geopolitical winners and losers. I should answer that briefly. I don't think it's clear yet. I don't think it's clear. At the moment, it looks as if China has the upper hand and the US is doing a kind of self-harm exercise. But I kind of agree with something Walter Russell Mead wrote in the Wall Street Journal this week. The US always looks like it's in total disarray at the beginning of a crisis. It looked like it was in total disarray at the time of Pearl Harbor. It looked like it was in total disarray at the time of 9/11. This is the way the US tends to handle crises. It rapidly learns. And I think that I'm going to put a bet on the American system's resilience and its ability to solve problems rather than on China's centralized system, because I think the pathologies are much deeper in the Chinese case. And I'm not convinced that Xi Jinping really has won this argument yet.
Thank you.
Niall, I received a question from a participant. If I may, the question is, will government and the state come out more authoritarian after this crisis, enjoying the power of implementing policies and having access to citizens' lives and data? If you could comment on that. Obviously, we know that's the modus operandi of China, so I think that's not applicable to China, the question, but thinking more of the Western countries.
Well, in the case of Hungary, the answer is clearly yes, because the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, has lost very little time putting a crisis to good use by giving himself emergency powers in a way that is distinctly redolent of interwar Central Europe. I think there will be other countries in which so-called strong men will seek to strengthen their grip further on political institutions. But it doesn't need to be this way. In fact, what I'm struck by when I look at Taiwan and South Korea is the extent to which the pandemic has been solved through decentralized, crowdsourced solutions. And that's actually something to be hopeful about. The data are already out there. I mean, we gave up our data long ago to technology companies in return for the supposedly free services that they provided. The difference is that in East Asia, they seem able to use the data for public good. And it's quite possible, as I think Taiwan and South Korea are showing, to take advantage of all the data that we have that allow us to identify locations and social networks without compromising citizens' privacy, so long as we do, as the Taiwanese have done so well, and engage citizens in that process. I think we need to try to learn from this experience how to exploit the opportunities that technology creates. Let's face it, if nothing else, the pandemic is illustrating the extraordinary power of technologies, and not just the one that we're using for this conversation, but all kinds of other technologies that are enabling many parts of our lives to continue even while we're stuck at home. So I think the possibility exists that far from strengthening authoritarian regimes, the pandemic will expose authoritarian regimes as rather ineffective and indeed downright mendacious. I think there'll be a number of authoritarian regimes that will actually be destroyed by this, beginning perhaps with the Iranian regime, which has pretty disastrously failed to manage the pandemic there. And if you read the crisis right and look at who got it right, you'll see that it's actually empowered citizens taking advantage of technology to arrive at solutions that are the real winners here. And the governments that learn how to translate digital data and digital networks into forms of policy solution that empower citizens, those will be the governments that come out ahead. I'm thinking here a little bit of Pierre's involvement in financial technology. I'm struck by the fact that there are all kinds of technology platforms which are offering public goods in this crisis in ways that simply weren't possible 10 years ago. So I'd rather think of it that way, and I have my fingers crossed that the pandemic will, on balance, damage the strong men around the world. It seemed last year as if the Putins and the Xi Jinpings and the Modis and the Bolsonaros and the Trumps and the Johnsons were the kind of winners of our time, of the post-financial crisis world. Well, I think to varying degrees, they've all been embarrassed by this crisis, and it's exposed the limitations of the populist style of government. I think that's possibly the silver lining to this cloud. Pierre, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I would like to add that, the technology is there. It's just a matter of the legal framework that the countries and the specific regimes use to unlock it. In Europe, we expect this to really change the discussion around GDPR. And as you have the ECB become the lender of last resort for the heavily indebted national banks, there will be a new discussion about several things, including, what kind of privacy is allowed when it's public health at risk. Not to mention the reshoring of public health procurement, which is something that will be discussed and is already being discussed in France and in Germany as a direct result of the crisis. But yeah, obviously, I agree with Niall's point that the technology is there. It's part of the solution in many places, and it's a social choice not to use the data. There just have to be real limits to how that data is used. We were in touch with a source in Singapore earlier today that was outlining all the things that the government has been doing there. And I'm sure you've seen the bracelets that some other nations are premiering to at least signal those that can go back to work and prevent the economy from completely imploding, as we were discussing earlier. And I think that risk in the United States is particularly high, given the just-in-time production models and the high levels of indebtedness in general in the private sector.
Thanks, Pierre. Niall, one very last question from me. There is a lot of war rhetoric going on, and governments are going to spend a lot. How to pay for this war? How is it going to be funded? What are the implications for government debt and fiscal policy going forward, in your view?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because it goes right to the heart of a subject I've spent years of my life thinking about. In fact, my academic career began with the question of war finance and the explosion of public debts caused by the First World War and the subsequent inflations in most countries. If you look at what the US is doing, we already have a $1 trillion deficit pre-pandemic. We're throwing another $2 trillion in there. Looks as if the US deficit to GDP number could be 15%, assuming that GDP contracts. That's a very big number for peacetime. The thing about pandemics is they're a bit like wars, and that's why presidents and prime ministers like to talk the language of war, the invisible enemy and all that, but not really like wars, because you can't conscript large numbers of young people and turn them into nurses and doctors as quickly as you can turn them into soldiers and sailors. And in a war against a pandemic, the appropriate analogy is that it's the nurses and doctors who are the soldiers, and your budget goes not on tanks and planes, but on research into vaccines and that sort of thing. So it doesn't have quite the same effect as a war. It's probably not as stimulative as a war. I mean, conventional wars usually turned out to be huge stimulus programs for economies. That was certainly true in the 20th century because of all the money that was spent on equipment. So this time around, we're kind of doing the fiscal and monetary policy of a war, but it's a pandemic. And as I said earlier, sorry, this cough is a recurrent feature of my life at the moment. As I said earlier, the pandemic's a 1 year to 18-month phenomenon. So before I die of COVID-19, the key point is that the pandemic ends and then you have a huge fiscal and monetary overhang. I think short run, this is definitely deflationary. Looking ahead 2 years, I really struggle to see how you bring back these bazooka shells that you fired. So I think there's a legitimate question about the dollar in particular, under the circumstances that we've we've just created, if I'm right about the pandemic, it's not as severe as 1918-19, and I'm pretty sure I am right, then the fiscal and monetary measures like the shutdowns are overkill. And I do find myself wondering just where we will be this time next year, or perhaps in the second half of 2021, as it becomes clear that the Congress and the Fed have to draw in all this supposed stimulus. We've learned after the financial crisis how hard that is. I'm sorry that answer has been made rather difficult by my cough, but how appropriate.
Yeah, if I can add one thing there, our current thinking is that, and we can let Niall cough in peace. Our current thinking is that the demand destruction that we're seeing in the United States and the effect that this is going to have on employment is heavily deflationary in the short run. It's a similar phenomenon to what we saw in 2008, where you have a lot of demand destruction. All those job losses translate into less money, less spending, less discretionary consumer spend, which drives the American economy. And then we have to remember, and this is something that a lot of commentators do not remember often enough, is that banks are the main creators of money in a system like the United States. And those banks are not making it easier to get a loan. So that restaurant that has gone out of business is going to be followed by probably an empty space and not a new restaurant in the short term, which means less employment in the future. That's why we're so skeptical about the idea of a quick, short, V-shaped recovery, especially if we let the problems linger. And as Niall said, we commit this economic, we commit ourselves to this economic cataclysm. Obviously, over the longer run, what we worry about is inflation and how all that overhang in the monetary and fiscal stimuli that we are already seeing in Western societies is going to impact over the medium run. In emerging markets, it should be inflationary in the short run, because at the end of the day, emerging markets, except for Ecuador, that doesn't have a real monetary authority because it's pegged to the dollar, have to go back to their central banks and print more. And that printing, which is not backed by hard currency, and they don't have the ability to create money at zero rates, translates into inflation in the short run. So, we expect an uptick in inflation and devaluation in places like Turkey, Argentina, Colombia. Obviously, the more fiscally conservative countries in Latin America, like Chile and Peru, have been saving for these kind of moments. So they are relative winners in the grander scheme of things. But what is inflationary in the short run in emerging markets, we think is deflationary in places like the United States, where there's going to be a lot of destruction of demand and destruction of money, especially as banks retrench. And we're already seeing how they are, despite the Fed, despite the federal government retrenching lending and cutting credit lines everywhere.
Thank you very much, Pierre, Niall, Chris.
So I think we're getting to the end of the webinar. I would like to thank, on behalf of Itaú, Unibanco, Niall's and Pierre's presence here. Was a very fruitful conversation, and hope to see you soon. And I hope you feel better, Niall, also soon.
So sorry about the cough, but I guess it kind of adds a certain realism to our Zoom webinar in the time of COVID-19. I thoroughly. I hope that I don't test positive. The good news is that you can't transmit this virus through Zoom, so you're all safe, at least in that respect.
Yeah, that was one of the questions I received on my WhatsApp in the last few minutes. People were a bit concerned about it, and they also wanted to issue to feel better soon.
Thanks very much indeed. A pleasure to speak to you all.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Bye.
Take care.
Obrigado a todos. Estamos encerrando aqui.